Hello, I want to welcome you to another study, and this is Dennis Tucker for the Life Road to Christ in Litchfield, Kentucky. On Wednesday nights, we've been studying a kind of a timeline of Israel, and that we've gone through really Old Testament timeline of all the way from Genesis up down to the end of Second Kings. So in our study of First Second Kings, we dealt with basically showing the downward decline of Israel all the way through that time period to the point of the northern 10 tribes being taken into captivity, and then Judah now is the only tribe left, and they are about ready to be taken into captivity. And so this lesson will deal with 2 Kings chapter 23, the actual last few verses of chapter 23 through chapter 25, which is the end of 2 Kings. And one thing to keep in mind as far as relating who's involved in this here, who else lived during this time period, and that is you have the prophets of Jeremiah is very prominent during this time period. Daniel will be prominent also during some of this time period. Ezekiel and maybe one or two others I can't think of right now, but they are the prophets during this period of downward decline that we're going to be studying in this lesson right here. And as we end at the last lesson, Josiah was the last good king of Judah, and Josiah goes out to get in a battle with Pharaoh Necho of Egypt at a place called Megiddo. And at that place, Josiah is killed. And that's important because God had made a promise to Josiah during his lifetime that Judah would not be taken captivity as long as he was alive. But after that happened, then basically God tells him that the people will be taken off into captivity. And so as you look at this time period, again, we don't have now three main kings that Judah talked about. Jehoiakim, and that we're going to read about him in chapter 23, verse 35. And then we have Eliakim, whose name was changed to Joachim in chapter 24. And then Zedekiah in chapter 24, the last part of chapter 24, and in chapter 25. And to show you the weakness of Judah during this time period, that actually these men were selected by Egypt and then by Babylon to be the king of Judah, and to the point of even renaming them to show the total control they had over the people, over the kings of Judah during this time period. So in Jeremiah, the first chapters 2, and I'm going to just kind of intertwine here a little bit of Jeremiah into our study of 2 Kings. But in Jeremiah 1, verse 2, that mentions to us, in verse 1 actually, in the days of Josiah, and that is that Jeremiah is prophesying at the end of Josiah's reign. In 13th year's reign, it says, and then in chapter 3, it goes on, it says, it came also in days of Jehoiachin, son of Josiah. And it goes on, it said, in the 11th year of Zedekiah, the king, son of Josiah. And so that kind of mentions to us this time period that overlaps what we're going to study about in this lesson. And so as you start off here in chapter 23, verse 31, we read here after Josiah's death, his son Jehoahaz becomes king. And it says he reigns for a grand total of 3 months in Jerusalem. So not a very long reign at all. However, long enough because 32 describes him, says he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. And then verse 33 explains what happened to him, and that is Pharaoh Necho put him in prison at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And so again, showing you the powerlessness, the weakness of Judah this time, that Pharaoh Necho was able to just come in and take this man out of office and put somebody else in there. And so at the end of verse 34 says, Pharaoh took Jehoahaz and went to Egypt, and he died there. So that's how his reign ends here. And again, as you look at, we see that Judah by this time is kind of like just a vassal empire, a vassal country, really under the total influence of somebody else. As you go on in verse 31, and we just mentioned here that Pharaoh Necho is able to take the king of Judah and take him to Riblah. And then also in that verse there, verse 33 says, he imposed on the land a tribute 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. In other words, he's able to tax as he wants, taxing this foreign country, basically the people of the foreign country. And then again, verse 34, then Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in place of his father Josiah, and changed the name to Jehoiakim. So again, the total domination is what we're seeing here. And then in verse 35, so Jehoiakim gave the silver and gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land to give money according to the command of Pharaoh. He enacted the silver and gold from the people of the land. And it just kind of reminds me, when you read through this description, I'm old enough that I remember the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had all these satellite countries around them, Czechoslovakia and Poland and other countries. And you really realize that while there was lines on the map that said this was Poland or this was Czechoslovakia or some other country, you realize really they were simply vassal states, that really the Soviet Union controlled them, Russia controlled them. And so that's what we have during this time period. And as you read about this, we find in Daniel, the first chapter, verse 1, and we talked about the overlapping of different prophets during this time period. But Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 says, in the 30th year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And so here's kind of our timeline so far. That is, Josiah dies around 607 BC. And the first captivity, the first time that Babylon comes in and takes people off the land, is around 605, 604 BC. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a timeline. We'll refer back to that a number of times in this lesson. As it goes on, 2 Kings 24th chapter, though, in verse 3, it says, because of the sins of Manasseh. And Manasseh, we have studied an earlier lesson. He's a king that has offered sacrifice to Baal, to the point of sacrificing his own children, and that he had simply gone full-fledged into idolatry in this early part of his reign. And so according to all they had done, also because of the innocent blood they had shed, again, the idea of the human sacrifice, for they had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and which the Lord had not pardoned. And so the reason all this is going to happen is that when Manasseh is doing this, God said, I'm going to punish Judah. I'm going to take them off their land. And so that's what we have going on here. Again, in Jeremiah 36, chapter 3, is during the time of this king that we mentioned here, Jehoiakim, that we find that Jeremiah brings the law of God, brings prophecy to the king. And here's the response of the king. In Jeremiah 36, verse 23, it says, and it happened when Jehudi had read 3 or 4 columns that the king cut it with a scribe's knife and cast it in the fire that was on the hearth until all the scroll was consumed in the fire that was on the hearth. And so showing a total disrespect for the word of God. And that is, Jeremiah had a scribe write down the words of God. The scribe takes the words of God and teaches or shows it to the priest. The priest take it and show it to the king, and the king simply takes it and throws it in the fire. Okay, showing disrespect for God's word. Then you go on here in 2 Kings 24, chapter verse 8, we find Jehoiachin, then the next king was 18 years old and became king. And basically what happens is that these kings would rule for a while and then decide to rebel. They rebel against Babylon, and that's when they got in trouble. And so he did evil, verse 9, did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. And in verse 10, it said, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And so you have this time here again of the besieging of Jerusalem. And we find in 24, verse 11, it goes on and talks about what happens during this time period. In verse 12, it says, then Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his servants, his princes, and his officers went out to the king of Babylon. And the king of Babylon, in the eighth year of his reign, took him as prisoner. And so again, the removal of administration, we may call it today. And it goes on in verse 15, we find, it says, he carried Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. The king's mother, the king's wives, his officers, and the mighty of the land he carried into captivity from Jerusalem and Babylon. All the valiant men, 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths, 1,000, all who were strong and fit for war. These the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. And so, in the pattern of things that happen here, that each time there is a captivity, people are taken off the land. It starts with the best. It starts with the scholars like Daniel and his friends, and talks about the men that were capable of war, and the craftsmen and the smiths. These were be high quality, high value people in the Babylonian government or in Babylonian system, and so they take them as captives at this time period. And again, just kind of relating this here to Jeremiah, because it is during the same time period. I'll give you a few verses, about 3 verses out of Jeremiah about Jehoiakim. And Jeremiah 22, verse 24 says, "As lives, says the Lord, though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, son of Judah, were the signet on my right hand, yet I would pluck you off." And therefore, it's talk about here the idea that there's going to be an end of the kings of Judah. And Jeremiah 22, verse 28 says, "Is this man Coniah despised? A despised, broken idol, a vessel in which is no pleasure? Are they cast out? He and his descendants, they cast land which they do not know." And that's what's going to happen. They're going to be taken off to another land. And basically, that God says, the righteous man down is childless. None of his descendants will rule again upon the throne of David. And Jeremiah 37, verse 1, it said, "Now King Zedekiah, son of Josiah, reigned instead of Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made king in the land of Judah." And so that gets to the point of the succession then. After Jehoiakim, we find in 2 Kings 24, verse 17, it said, "Then the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Joachim's uncle, king in his place, and changed name to Zedekiah." So again, a change of name, a change of governments, showing the total domination of Babylon. And as it goes on, we find in the 25th chapter now, it talks about that there's another rebellion. And so it says, in the 9th year of his reign, talking about Zedekiah's reign, eventually he gets a bright idea in the 10th month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon's army, came against Jerusalem and encamped against it. And they built a siege wall against it all around, so the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And this is kind of like the final straw here as far as Jerusalem's time under Babylon, allowing them to exist. And so as you read about the captivity, the siege of the city of Babylon and the captivity, in the 25th chapter, in verse 4, it said, "The king went by way of the plain." In other words, that when the walls were broken down, that Jerusalem had been breached, that Zedekiah and his people decided to try to make a run for it. And so the king went by the way of the plain, but the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king, and they overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his army was scattered from him, so that they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and they pronounced judgment on him. Then they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him with bronze feathers, and took him to Babylon. And this is just a kind of a sad end here to this man's reign. He was the evil king, but imagine here in the sense of the last thing he saw was actually his children being killed. And Jeremiah 32nd chapter 3 overlaps this, or says, "Zedekiah king of Judah has shut him up." Talking about Jeremiah. Jeremiah had told Zedekiah what's going to happen. And so the king responds here to somebody puts him in prison, saying, "Why do you prophesy and say, Thus says the Lord, behold, I will give the city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall take it." There were still people that believed that God would somehow rescue Jerusalem. And Jeremiah is saying, no, that's not going to happen. And so they were accusing Jeremiah of treason. And so then going to verse 4 says, "Zedekiah king of Judah shall not escape from the hand of the Chaldeans, but shall surely be delivered to the hand of the king of Babylon, and shall speak with him face to face, and shall see him eye to eye. Then he shall lead Zedekiah to Babylon, there he shall be until I visit him, says the Lord. Though you fight with the Chaldeans, you shall not succeed." And this is again before everything happens. But basically, Jeremiah is saying, this is what's going to happen, and you may try to stop it, but it's not going to work. That you will be taken off captivity. And as you go on to Jeremiah, the 52nd chapter now, And verse 10, it said, Then the king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and he killed all the princes of Judah and Riblah. And he also put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him in bronze feathers, took him to Babylon, and put him in prison till the day of his death. And it's fitting because Zedekiah is told he's going to be taken to a land he shall not see, and spend the rest of his life there. And this here shows how that happened. That is, he was blind. That he was his eyes were put out by Babylon, by Nebuchadnezzar. And then as it goes on in 2 Kings 25th chapter, we're dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. And so verse 9 talks about the Babylonian army and Nebuchadnezzar. They burned the house of the Lord and the king's house, all the houses of Jerusalem, that is, all the houses of the great. He burned with fire. And so we start seeing the total destruction of Jerusalem this time. The other times, like the 605 BC, there was really Jerusalem's left intact. In 597 BC, the second time Babylon comes up against Jerusalem, again they allow the city to still remain. But this time here, by 586 BC, it is going to be the total destruction of the city. And so it's going in verse 11, it said, Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive the rest of the people. He remained in the city, and the defectors had deserted to the king of Babylon with the rest of the multitude, but the captive guard left some of the poor of the land as vine dressers and farmers. So for the most part, the Jews taken off their land. And what the thing that was done during that time period by both Assyria and Babylon is they would move people around from one country to another, kind of breaking down any idea of country allegiance, of being identified with one nation over other. And so they just kind of mixed the people together. But it says here that they left a few of the Jews there on the land so as to take care of the land. After all, you got to have somebody there. And so what they're going to do eventually is they're going to bring other people from other countries into the land of Canaan. And they will intermix with some of these Jews and become what's later on is known as Samaritans. And so that's what's going on, though, is that only the poorest, only the vine dressers and the farmers, basically, those are the lower class, poor people, are going to be left there in the land of Canaan. And then 25th chapter, also down verse 8, it mentions us, and the captive guard took Seraiah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the second priest, and 3 doorkeepers. He also took out of the city an officer who had charge of the men of war, 5 men from the king's close associates who were found in the city, the chief recruiting officer of the army, who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people of the land who were found in the city. And as it goes on here, it said in verse 21, Then the king of Babylon struck them and put them to death at Riblah and the land of Hamath. Thus Judah was carried away captive from his own land. So we have kind of the end of anybody of any authority or any power. And Judah is gone now. He has totally wiped out the ruling establishment, the priest, the chief priest, and others that may have some kind of authority. They're gone now. And so in its place here in chapter 25, 2 Kings, verse 22, it said, Then he made Jedaiah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, governor. All the people remained in the land of Judah. Him Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had left. So here's kind of a vassal, again, governor. And basically his job is going to just keep the peace and persuade the people to obey Babylon, and everything's going to be okay. And Jedaiah has kind of the position of having a message that really was kind of intended to be one of comfort. And that is, stay here, serve Babylon, and it's going to be okay with you. But another way, it was not a message to comfort because it was serve Babylon. And so as you go read on through here, then some of the people of the Jews of Israel did not like Jedaiah. And so one of those, by the name of Ishmael, decides to rebel. And so in Jeremiah 25th chapter, verse 25, it said, But it happened in the 7th month that Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, the son of Elisheba, the royal family came with 10 men and struck and killed Gedaliah. Now, Gedaliah had been warned before this meeting that Ishmael was planning on killing him, and Gedaliah neglected the warning. He simply thought that's not going to happen, and so he was proven wrong, and he proved it with his life. At that point, then, what's going to happen? Well, again, God had told the Jews, stay here, don't run down to Egypt for safety and security. So, of course, what they did was exactly the opposite of what God said to do. In verse 25 said they were afraid of the Chaldeans. And so as you go on and look at Jeremiah, again, just kind of jump over there for a second or two. Because Jeremiah in the 43rd chapter, verse 5, says that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had left with Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, and Jeremiah the prophet, and Barak, the son of Neriah. And so that they were left in charge, but then the Jews rebelled and killed Gedaliah. And what they did was they decided to go to Egypt. In verse 7, so they went to the land of Egypt, and here and forward, they did not obey the voice of the Lord. And they went as far as Taphanes, that place of Taphanes in Egypt. And of course, what happens is that basically that Babylon winds up going down to Egypt and winds up bringing them back from captivity. They conquer Egypt and they bring these Jews back in to Canaan and then on to Babylon as captives. Now, Jehoiachin, that we had read about earlier, he's the one that didn't rule that long, but is evil. And it's kind of a side note here. But 25th chapter of 2 Kings, verse 27, it says, now it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, so a long time here, 37 years later on, the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, released Jehoiachin, king from Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a more prominent seat than those of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin changed from his prison garments, and he ate bread regularly before the king all the days of life. And as for his providences, there was a regular ration given him by provisions. There was given a regular ration given to him by the king, a portion for each day with all the days of his life. So kind of ironic here, and that is he's the one that kind of lives the rest of life in kind of comfort and ease. Now that doesn't mean he's repentant. It just means that the king of Babylon here has shown mercy to this king, and so he gets to enjoy the last years of his life. So again, the timeline then is you have in 605 BC, which we started reading about 2 Kings 23rd chapter. The latter part there, verse 31 on down. You have the first siege of Jerusalem. And this here is that Israel is no longer a sovereign nation now. Israel now is a vassal of somebody else, and that they take off Daniel and his companions in that first captivity. And then in about 598, and that is when there's rebellion there, and Jehoiakim rebels against Babylon, then we have the second captivity, and that involved people like Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's more to the common people, where Daniel, you read through the book of Daniel, and you find that Daniel is dealing with the elite ruling class of Babylon. Well, now Ezekiel's dealing with the Jews who are in captivity. He's with the common folks. And then Zedekiah reigns, and then Zedekiah rebels against Babylon. And it's about 588 to 586, another siege around Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem was destroyed. And you have the last captivity, and that would include Jeremiah, was during that time period, being taken to captivity. And now at that point, about 586 to about 537, you're going to have Judah in captivity. Judah in captivity. One of the things that Jeremiah talks about in a number of passages is that this captivity is going to last 70 years. And so if you count from about 605 BC, the first time that you had a group taken into captivity, about 7 years later, you're getting about 535, 534. And that's when we're going to start picking up the next timeline. And that's when we're going to start studying about Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. And that's what we're going to go into now in our next lessons of just kind of completing the timeline of Israel. But all the way through this, what we have seen then, from the time of 1 Kings, the first chapter with David is in his last days, to the point of Solomon and the splendor of Israel during that time period, for the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings, you see the wealth of Israel. But from that time onward, see the downward decline of Israel to finally the point that they're taken off captivity. And the reason because they forgot God, because they were worshiping idols, and they refused to listen and repent and turn back to God in the time of trials. And so God allowed them to be taken off captivity to teach them a lesson. But God remembered his people. And he's going to bring them back now, and we're going to have the restoration of the land of Israel. And so that's what we're going to pick up next week. I appreciate you watching. I hope this has been helpful in your studies of 1st and 2nd Kings. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I'll be glad to study with you. Be glad to deal with you either by letter or on Facebook. You can text me, and I'll be glad to study with you. If you have an opportunity to come be with us at the Lilac Road Church of Christ, our building is located at 1687 Lilac Road, Louisville, Kentucky. And our time services are Sunday mornings of 9:30 Bible class and 10:25 worship. On Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. we have Bible classes again. I do appreciate you watching. I hope this has been helpful. And feel free to ask any questions. And if you need any help in any way, let me know. Hope you have a good week.